Happy Mother's Day to everyone. So this is a day ever since my mother passed away some 9 years ago. So Mother's Day like this brings back, memories of good times, happy times with my mom, and some moments like, really, Mom? What the heck? Some of you know what I'm talking about with your own mother. But today, it's not just about honoring our own mother, but it's about honoring our mothers who are also grandmothers, aunts, and sisters, and even people said earlier that people do not have children of their own. And we also recognize that not all the happy moments, and for some, it's a challenging relationship, and even difficult situations and relationships, they have to work at it. Today, or maybe in the past for some of you, that today meant we bought flowers, we bought gifts for moms, and some even took our moms or parents on a trip to a nice vacation even. But what if I were to tell you that the origin of Mother's Day and how it started had nothing to do with buying your mom gifts and flowers? See, Mother's Day was a call to action to improve the lives of children, the families, in the early days of 1850s. Now, remember those dates, 1850s. The spiritualism with the Fox sisters came about in 1848. So around this time, it was about social causes, awakening, protesting the carnage of war after the Civil War. So what went around these times were the anti-Civil War movement, anti-slavery, anti-discrimination, and the women's right to vote. And most of all this was carried by women, mainly in the suffrage movement of women. And many of these women in the suffrage movement were also spiritualists themselves. So you might want to ask, who and what was the women's suffrage movement? So you'll have seen the Statue of Liberty when you go to New York on a Liberty Island. That was given to us in 1886 by the country France. And on that year, there was a dedication that was held on Liberty Island in New York. It was then President Grover Cleveland. So during the dedication of the Statue of Liberty, it's out in the bay, ocean. So a large boat full of 200 or so women sailed by. They were all holding signs that read, "American women have no liberty." Now picture that image, all these people, dignitaries, the president, talking about liberty, and this powerful woman started to fight back, demanding the right to vote. These were the suffragists, people who stood and testified in Congress and testified in churches. And many of these people at the same time were abolitionists, anti-slavery, and spiritualist women who had voices by way of mediumships, trans mediums. See, back then, not many women were allowed to speak, even in churches. But if you happened to be trans medium or mediums, speaking sort of in tongue or speaking in the words of a spirit, they allowed this woman to talk. So a lot of these women were naturally spiritualists. Now, I'll come back to the women's right to vote, which is the 19th Amendment. But let's go back in time to that 1850s. So there was a woman named Anne Reeves Jarvis, who she was the founder of Mother's Work Day. Now, she had a huge family herself. She had like 11 children, but 2 of her children died before the age of 3. And out of 11 or 12 children, only 4 lived to the adulthood. Now, these were obviously very poor living conditions, especially where she's from, West Virginia in the Appalachian Mountain regions. Very poor, uneducated. So her and her mothers around the town created a day for mothers to work for better sanitation, cleanliness, and better health. So around this time, there was a civil war that went on, and there were, of course, lots of casualties on both sides. Ann Jarvis, being in the West Virginia, she got to see both, the North and South fighting right under her. So one of the things that she did was she taught other women how to get along for both sides and treat them with equal respect. Not only that, she also taught sanitation, how to do disinfection and all that. So some years with that, there was another woman named Julia Ward Howe, W-A-R-D, Howe, H-O-W-E. She was also a mother. She was a poet, author, kind of wealthy, but she was an activist, abolitionist by herself. And she was inspired by this lady, Ann Jarvis. So some of you remember that Battle Hymn of the Republic, a poem. So Julia Howe actually wrote that words in the war. You guys know that song, Glory, glory, hallelujah. You know that song. So she's the one who wrote that, a Republic song. Now, more men died, supposedly, in the Civil War from disease and prisoner camps rather than war itself. So Julia Ward Howe saw lots of people dying, especially from unsanitary conditions, and people were just dying left and right. So she was out there as an activist, an anti-war activist. And her husband, Julia and her husband, joined the U.S. Sanitary Commission as well. Now, after the war, Julia and her husband wanted to bring an end to war, like I said, and an equality to all people, regardless of race, religion, gender, and nationality. So as a poet, as a humanist, as a woman suffragist, she cared about all these suffering people and dying people. And she was a really strong advocate for those social justice around the special times. Now, she also wrote, what she's famous for is that she wrote the Mother's Day Proclamation in 1870, calling all mothers as an appeal to all the other mothers to spare their sons from this horrific war and dying. So there is a YouTube video. It's a 2-minute YouTube video by actresses who are reciting this proclamation. So I want to play that and see if I can do that right now.
Mother's Day really was, in its origin, an anti-war day, an anti-war statement. Julia Ward Howe was sickened by what had happened during the Civil War, the loss of life, the carnage, and she created Mother's Day as a call for women all over the world to come together and create ways of protesting war, of making a kind of alternate government that could finally do away with war as an acceptable way of solving conflict.
Arise then, women of this day. Arise, all women who have hearts. Whether your baptism be of water or of tears,
Say firmly, we will not have questions answered by irrelevant agencies. Our husbands will not come to us reeking of carnage for caresses and applause.
Our sons shall not be taken from us to unlearn all that we have been able to teach them of charity, mercy, and patience. We,
the women of one country, are too tender to those of another country to allow our sons to be trained to injure theirs. From the bosom of the devastated earth, a voice goes up with our own. It says, disarm.
Disarm.
disarm. The sword of murder is not the balance of justice. Blood does
not wipe our dishonor, nor violence indicate possession. As men have
often forsaken the plow and the anvil at the summons of war, let women now leave all that may be left of home for a great and earnest day of council.
Let them meet first as women to bewail and to commemorate the dead. Let them solemnly take counsel with each other
as to the means whereby the great human family can live in peace.
Each bearing after his own time the sacred impress,
not of Caesar, but of God.
In the name of womanhood and
humanity, I earnestly ask that a General Congress of Women without limit of nationality
may be appointed and held at some place deemed most convenient,
and at the earliest period consistent with its objects,
to promote the alliance of the different nationalities,
the amicable settlement of international questions,
the great and general interest of peace.
This lady, Julia, also advocated all the moms to leave their homes and work for peace in their communities. And a special day, Mother's Day for Peace. She also traveled around the world advocating anti-war sentiments. Now, on the second Sunday in June 1872, the first Mother's Day was celebrated, such Mother's Day for Peace. And this went on for next 30 years or so without much fanfare. Now, the official Mother's Day, as we know it, it didn't happen until Anna Jarvis. She's now daughter of Anne Jarvis from Mother's Workday. So this Anne Jarvis, the original lady from the Appalachian Mountain, she passed away in 1905. So in honor of her mother, she organized, Anna, her daughter, organized the first Mother's Day in 1908 at a Methodist church in West Virginia where she was going. She had, at the time, she had the money, financial backing of a Philadelphia department store owner and a few other people. So this happened throughout the state, throughout local churches. Oh, by the way, Anne Reeves attended Unitarian churches, which is sort of like spiritualist churches back then. And she was also to have a very keen interest in spiritualism. So anyway, so this happened in other churches and states that followed on until in 1914, it became an official holiday by President Woodrow Wilson, who signed the measure. So this is how it started with her mother back in 1850s in Appalachian Mountains. So you see, Mother's Day became possible, and it started with solid background of social justice and some really bad, I want to say badass, but I can't say that. Some really tough mothers around at the time. You know, I can just, so let me take you back to how the 19th Amendment, women's right to vote, was passed. It didn't pass right away, but it didn't pass right away until August of 1920, thanks to this Tennessee legislator with a mighty, powerful mother, his mother. So the 15th Amendment, going back to 1850s, gave rights for all men, including black men, to the right to vote. So this happened in 1870, but we know that the actual voting of black men didn't really happen until 1965 with the Voting Rights Act. But in paper, in Constitution, it was passed in 1870, by the way. So what happened back then was interesting. The people who were active in getting this passed, the 15th Amendment, the rights of all men, including black men, to vote, were the suffrage women who advocated early on the right to vote for everybody, including the women. So there were two factions going on at this time. There were people like Susan B. Anthony, who was an activist, abolitionist, and suffrage movement. She wanted women's right to vote inside the 15th Amendment, along with black men's right to vote. However, there was other people, famous abolitionists like Elizabeth Stanton, Maud, Miss Cady. These people were afraid that it wasn't going to pass if the women's right to vote was attached to this 15th Amendment. So Susan B. Anthony, who was very adamant about this, actually, by the way, Susan B. Anthony was very shy in public. She didn't speak much. And I want to, I'm just going off the tangent here, but she spoke about spiritualism this way, because she's gone on to seances and saw trans mediums and things like that. She said, "Oh dear, if the spirits would only just make me a trans medium and put the right thing into my mouth." But that didn't happen. But later, she spoke many times at Lilydale Spiritualist camp up in New York in the summer of 1890s. So it did pass 15th Amendment without the awarding of the woman's right to vote. But what's interesting is how 19th Amendment, the women's right to vote, some 50 years down the road, happened. So ever since the 15th Amendment, there were activists, people like Elizabeth Stanton, who actually wanted to do a grassroots campaign, state by state, local strength. So this went on for like some 50 years. Imagine that. These were all women, suffrage women, who did this. So in 1920, I told you it passed finally. So what happened was that by then, 35 states finally ratified the measure. Now, go figure, but it needed one more state, 36 states, to require the required needed for Constitution. So it became down to one state. And no, it's not Florida. Thank God. It came down to Tennessee. So what happened in Tennessee after passing like California, Seattle, or Washington, everywhere. So it came down to Tennessee, one state required. So it passed on the local state Senate without any problem. However, it stalled in the House of Representatives. So obviously, there were thousands of protest people from both sides, people who were for, people who were against. They all went to Nashville, the capital of Tennessee, and protested. So people who were for the passing of 19th Amendment wore sashes and all these women carrying yellow roses, symbol. And there were on the other side who also brought in red roses, who were against the woman's right to vote. And there were red rose pins. So they were fighting. So what happened in the House when it came down to vote, before the vote, there was a motion to amend the subject of women's right to vote. And the vote was 48 to 48. It tied, deadlocked. So, of course, everybody, including all the suffrage women and abolitionists and all the activists, they were pretty sad because they knew it would not pass with 48 tied vote. So finally, in the House Speaker called the measure to vote, knowing that it was going to be deadlocked. But at the time, in Tennessee, there was this legislator who became a legislator. The youngest legislator at the time, he was only 24 years old. His name, Harry Byrne. Now, he was also the opposing factor, wearing red roses. He was not for it. So, when the vote happened, just before the voting, Harry Burns received a note or letter from his mother. His mother's name is Phoebe Byrne, or known to her family and friends as Miss Fab. So, in the letter or the note, it says, she wrote, "Hurrah, the vote for suffrage. Don't keep them in doubt. I noticed some of the speeches against. They were bitter. I have been watching you to see how you stood, but have not noticed anything yet." And she ended by saying, "Be a good boy and help Mrs. Cat put the rat in ratification." So, still wearing the red roses, Harry Burns walks in and voted with a single syllable "aye" to the vote, to the surprise of many. Everybody, I'm sure, freaked out, especially the legislators who were against. So with that powerful note from his mother, the state of Tennessee became the 36th state to ratify the proposed 19th Amendment, making it official. So like I say, it took some 50 years to get to this point, one by one, state by state. Can you imagine the suffering and the activists and the energy that it took? So this started from the Mother's Day, going back to 1850s, you know. So people were like Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Stanton, Carrie Catt. These were the women who helped women's rights movement. Now, later, with his mother's note, when Harry Burns finally made a comment, he said, I believe, when he asked why he voted the way he did, he said, "I believe we had a moral and legal right to ratify." And he continued, said, "I know that mother's advice is always safest for her boys to follow. And my mother wanted me to vote for ratification." Thank God for this mama's boy. And ladies and gentlemen, never underestimate the power of your mother and her words. Happy Mother's Day, everyone.